Welcome to the Stellar Gaming Dev YouTube channel. I'm Andrin, Stellar Gaming Dev's personal assistant. If you are returning from part 1, how to use Firebase in GDevelop, glad to see you again. If you stumbled upon this video and don't know much about Firebase, you might want to check out part 1. Today, we are going to see how I use the write and retrieve actions for Firebase in GDevelop, and I am going to give you a visual example of it in action using a game in development I was working on earlier. This tutorial is not recommended for beginners or people who don't know anything about variables in their game development journey. My plan is to stick to easier tutorials and GDevelop extensions, but I saw an old post where someone asked for a template for Firebase, and I decided to do this. I'll try to do requests if I see them and have time. Someone wanted to know how to use AI in GDevelop, such as real-time conversations in your game, and I'll probably drop a video on that too in the future. But enough about that, let's discuss Firebase write and read actions within GDevelop and how I have used them. So the game that I was tasked to work on by Stellar Gaming Dev, I showed a bit of it in the last video, and it is called Z-Shuffle. I am still developing it, but the majority of this game requires a lot of Firebase magic, which involves writing and reading actions. So I am going to tell you a little about the actions and how they work, and show you them updating in real time as of this video's production. Remember to make sure your Firebase configuration string is correct in your game's properties, because if it's not, you're going to have I'm going to show some of the things I did with this particular title. When Stellar Gaming Dev gave me my assignment, I knew that I had to do my best. This particular game involves things like saving user IDs and player stats. Even though the event sheet looks like someone threw a bucket of random code at the screen, everything here is important. Your own game doesn't have to be this messy or wordy, but let's inspect some conditions and actions, and then afterwards, I'll show it updating in Firebase as I make changes in the game. As you can see in this video, I am at the beginning of the game and there are several things I have going on here. The first thing is that in this condition I am checking for authentication. The actions performed set a wait time and show 2 text objects. However, the most important one specifically involves both a variable and Firebase. Change the text of a scene variable named player ID and set it to this. Let's check it out. You can see the actual description is named, modify the text string of a scene variable. Now this particular value here will get the user ID from Firebase and store that in the player ID variable. Let's go look at the variables for this scene. For this particular game, notice that aside from the player ID, I have many other variables. The variables here store important information for when a player first enrolls and are the player stats. It has information about things like the house, ranking, cards, rank titles, and score to name a few. The majority are set by default as they are just the starting points for the player. For the next code block to work, 2 conditions must be fulfilled. The text input object named username must be 6 characters or greater and the create button must be pressed. If these conditions are met, the text of a variable with the player stats will be changed to whatever the user puts in the text input object. There is a wait action to give GDevelop a little time to perform the process, and then we go to the action to write the data to Firebase. Let's inspect this one closer. Here you would select the action to write a field to Firestore. Here's where you put the name of the collection in your Cloud Firestore database you want to store this information. In this case, it would be the collection named users. Everything is case sensitive and it must be wrapped in quotations. This value here directly calls the variable I loaded and stored earlier to retrieve the Firebase UID of the player. This is the document within the Firebase Cloud Store where the information will be stored for that specific user. This value creates a field in that document which will be called username. Remember the variable where I stored the username after the user presses the create button? Well, that is what is being written to the field username in the Cloud Firestore. It's going to be the player's actual username within the game. This is where you would put a variable to check for errors to know if the action was successful or not, and you could display it to a user through a text object. This line is important depending on what you want done. If you want the new information to be added to an existing field and update the value, select Yes. If you select No, then it will rewrite the entire thing, including anything else you have saved in that document. This is not a problem if you just have one field, but it can be a nightmare if you have several unique fields and you write over everything, so be careful with this and test it out first. This action stops the Create button from being pressed again. There is a wait action, and then here is another variable. This particular variable is named Scene Tasks, and it tracks the various things a user does. For example, if the player presses the Create button, then the value of 1 will be added to the Scene Task variable. If the player does another condition such as something specific, like pressing another button, then I'll add 1 again in the actions, which would bring the Scene Tasks variable to 2. And let's say, for instance, I have a condition that says, if the value of Scene Tasks variable is equal to 3, then do these actions. Going back into the game, if the player does anything that has that specific action, it would add 1 again to the Scene Task variable, bringing the total to 3. Then the condition that checks for this value would do all the actions, like disabling all buttons and going to the next screen, or whatever you choose. Moving down, this section is just for the display panel. It lists all the text objects for the player stats. You'll see them when I show the example in the game. This is for the house selections, and it has the navigation buttons that cycle through the houses that can be selected. Let's head down to where all the drama unfolds. So as you can see, there is a lot going on here. This specific condition only works when a certain image group is listed, making sure the title of the house is displayed correctly when the proper image is shown. Pressing the Select button triggers the actions that will display all the default values of the appropriate variables into specific text objects located within the display box. This includes things like player rank, house, title, and score. The Select button and navigation buttons are then disabled from being pressed again. Moving all the way down, you can see there are several Firebase write actions. The setup is the same as I showed for the username to be written into the Cloud Firestore. The only difference is the field that will be written says house, and this is the specific value that is stored in the variable. You can see the last line is marked yes, so it will create a new separate field without getting rid of any other ones also in the document. And you can see the Firebase write actions for all the fields I want in the specific user document are here as well. Now that I have given you a general idea of how the game I'm creating works, it won't be so confusing to figure out what is going on when I show you. Let's move on to the game for the example. This is a cropped portion of how that section looks when loaded in GDevelop. I'm sure you're quite aware by now this game deals with creating a user profile, joining a zodiac house, and going against other people to see who can get the highest score and rank. Since JJ is from the early era of card games like Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh!, this game is loosely based on that concept. It's way more challenging to set this up than it sounds, hence why we are still, quote-unquote, developing it. But what is the fun without a little challenge? So I am going to load the game from the title screen again because remember in part 1, I showed I had an account I could log into, and it would automatically verify me. This then turns on the global Boolean variable, user logged in, which I mentioned in part 1, and it would be persistent throughout the entire game on every scene. So you wouldn't have to do a condition that checks for authentication on that particular scene, like I showed you earlier. You could simply do a condition that checks if the user logged in Boolean is true, and then as an action, you could get the Firebase UID and load it into a variable on every scene at the beginning of each scene. I just like testing different ways of doing things. So just like in part 1, I am automatically logged in. Instead of exiting though, let's click on Enroll. Alright, here is a full test shot of the game selection portion, but let me crop it again to focus on the specific section where the user will enter their details. Here is where I mentioned the fields where the information would be displayed on screen. There's a space for rank, house, and the other info. While these are normal text objects that won't change, the hyphens next to them are the text objects that will. Let's do the username first. I am going to have the GDevelop game window on the right side, and on the left side, you will see that I have the Cloud Firestore document visible with no data. Let's see how putting things in the game will appear in Firebase. I am going to give myself a username. Today, I am going to be named Thanos Jenkins. You can see here that I have the minimum and maximum characters for the username set. More than 6, less than 20. Here is an example of how the navigation section works as I scroll through the houses. Let me go ahead and just select a house first, before a username. Once I select a house, it will populate in the display box below with the name of the house and the default values. Then the Firebase actions will write everything to the Cloud Firestore for me. Now I will save my username, Thanos Jenkins, as well by pressing the Create button. This is loaded in both my display box, and then it is written to Cloud Firestore database, where it will be stored until I erase it. Since all of this information is now stored, you could retrieve it directly at any point you need to. This gives you more control over the data in your game. Of course, with great power comes great responsibility. So how does this actually come in handy? Well, a few things would be. It's good for directly monitoring a user's specific game data. In this game-specific case, we could see who is in the lead, who has the most wins, and most points, and make accurate judgments, like who is the top player. Another way this could come in handy. Since I have the username stored for that specific player, I could create an action at the beginning of the scene that retrieves the username for that user, put it into a text object, and greet them specifically. I think the best one would be that in certain cases, with games like this, the information stored could help you if a lot of people want to play, and that is a lot of information to manage. This will help with that some. Storing it in Firebase, or rather Cloud Firestore, makes that process easier. But now, since we have it stored, how exactly are we going to retrieve it from the Cloud Firestore? Let's take a quick look at how this can be done. Alright, so I have deleted all the original data from the specific document for the game I am working on, so I can show the full scope of what is being written and how it is being retrieved. Of course, this game is nowhere near finished, but I can still show my progress. Let's go ahead and start from the beginning. This time my username will be Johnny Bravo. I will then select the house I want to be a part of, and the default values for the variables will be loaded into each text object. It looks like there is something in my actions that is not making this display as a text object, even though it is being written correctly to the Cloud Firestore. It's probably just something I simply overlooked. I can fix it later since it doesn't really break anything. I am going to move this over here and show the card selection process and how it is written to the Cloud Firestore as I perform it. You can see here, this is for a lineup of 3 cards. When I press a card, it will ask me if I want to accept, and if I do, it will be loaded into a text object and then written to Cloud Firestore with those stats. Let's select 2 more, since the max you can have is 3. Once I select all 3, it will notify me that my deck is set and I can either accept or decline. But look at all the data that is now in my Cloud Firestore. This means that for this specific user, I can retain and pull the appropriate data as needed. With all these stats stored, we can go to my other event sheet, and I can show you exactly what I used to retrieve it from Cloud Firestore. This section is labeled Player Info Load. You can see the familiar condition to check authentication, but as I mentioned earlier, it may not be necessary. Here are all the actions. This is where I load all the fields for the player. The title, cards selected, their order, and other information. If we take a look into this action, you will see it has the same setup as the Write a Field action. In this case, it says field to get and callback variable to store the field value. This is what is used to retrieve information from Cloud Firestore. After this, there is a wait action, and then below this are all the text objects in the display box and what they will be changed into based on what is retrieved and put into the specific variables from the Cloud Firestore database. When GDevelop is loaded, all the cards will be displayed in the order I chose them, and then the player display box will show the current stats of the player. So basically, if I were to win, it would save and write that to the Cloud Firestore, and the next time I have a match it will pull those stats for me to see, or for my opponents to see, and if they want to take the risk of going against me based on my current level. So that is about it. My event sheet looks like a textbook, but that's because of the type of game I decided to tackle. This tutorial is just to show you how Firebase actions in GDevelop can be useful to you if you ever need them for anything. That's the pros, but there are some cons. Firebase has a free tier, but after a certain number of reads and writes, you'll have to pay. While this threshold is generous and would take a while to reach if you have a smaller game, if your game gets big it will get pricey. So I would use this for small or mid-sized games. Even if it does help with dealing with data, you still need to monitor it and make sure things are functioning correctly and make sure everything is secure. This is probably easier to do if you team up with a friend, but if you manage it alone, that's fine too. Well, that concludes the tutorial for Firebase and GDevelop. After this I can go do a video on different extensions. I'll discuss what the extension is, who created it, and how you can use it in your game. I think I have one more, not so beginner-friendly thing to do, and that is connecting GDevelop to an LLM like ChatGPT or Google Gemini. I've tried this and I was able to chat with it in GDevelop, ask a question and get a response. This would be pretty interesting to have if you were doing a quiz or an RPG game in GDevelop. Thanks for watching today. If you found this video useful or it gave you some ideas for your own game, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more. Feel free to drop any suggestions on GDevelop things, and we can all research it and break it down together. Speaking of breaking it down,
I don't like all these game errors. I'll see you later. Give me Firebase and GDevelop so I can retrieve some data.